Thank you. So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody. 3:32, we'll begin with the special council meeting for Wednesday, April 5th, call to order. And we'll start with adoption of the agenda. Anyone wish to make a motion to it? Councillor Williams?
I can make a motion that council adopts the agenda as presented.
Thank you, Councillor Williams. Any discussion? All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. And that's it. We're on to 3-1. So the presentation with Accurate Assessment Group. Welcome everybody, and we'll go around the room here real quick for introductions, make sure everybody knows who's in the room, and we'll start with our acting CAO.
Andre Bashan, the Director of Infrastructure and acting CAO.
Devin Williams, councillor for Division 7, Fort Assiniboine, Timu.
Bruce Prestidge, Councillor for Division 5, Blue Ridge.
I'm John Burrows, Reeve.
Peter Kilkin, I'm Councillor for Division 6, Freeman River, or Freeman River, East Lake.
Jeremy Wilhelm, Division 4, Whitecourt East.
And Alan Dean, I'm Whitecourt Central, which is like West Mountain Road.
Victoria Chen, Director of Corporate Services.
Nikita Ganopcha, Communications Assistant.
In the
Corinne
very
Scott,
back.
Legislative Services and Communications.
Peter McKay, Development Officer.
I'm Troy Bertles, your appointed assessor with Accurate Assessment Group.
Chris Meadows, Accurate Assessment. Sean Barrett, I'm the Industrial Manager at Accurate Assessment.
All right. With that,
Perfect.
I'll hand it over to you.
So are we so special that we got our own meeting?
Sure. Yeah, it's just the way it worked out,
Yeah,
but
fair enough.
yeah.
So originally, as a matter of fact, as recent as 3 hours ago, Sean wasn't going to be able to make it. So we were going to virtual in Sean and Ray to do the industrial side of the presentation, but luckily he was able to join us today in person. So, does everybody have a copy of our presentation?
Yep, we have it up on our screens here,
Are we?
and yep, it's gonna be
It'll be
up
up
there
there?
too.
Okay.
Sorry that this room isn't as nicely set up as the other office, but we do have it at least.
That's okay. So, you guys have seen us before, you know who we are. I'm not gonna dwell on introductions and brag about our company and all that good stuff. Although I do wanna point out that we celebrated our 25th year of existence last year, so we're very proud of that. We took families and staff out to Jasper for the weekend and played some golf and did some hiking and ate some good food and celebrated, so we're pretty proud of that accomplishment. Purpose of today obviously is to discuss the changes in assessment year over year, and how that'll impact you when you make your tax rate decisions. It's very timely. I don't believe you've set your tax rates yet.
Nope, not yet.
Good. So this is good time to have this information. You can understand the shifting and whatnot that's happening. Switch to the next map. Yeah, that one there. So we recently updated this map, and it's a lot more green now than when we supplied this document to you. You may or may not be aware, but we were awarded a number of municipalities under the provincial designated industrial property assessment contract. As you know, recently the province took that section of the assessment in-house for Woodlands County, so unfortunately we don't do the DIP property. Sean will talk about that a little bit more in his presentation. But yeah, and then one page next, I just want to point out the top, trusted advisor. We just want you as council to look at us as your trusted advisors when it comes to anything assessment. So if you ever have any questions about assessment, call me, email, whatever the case is. We'd rather you be educated or informed properly rather than try to formulate an answer yourself. For staff, you've seen that slide many times. Okay, so on this page here, I'm just going to let Chris talk a little bit about this.
Okay, so
here shows the difference between 2021 and 2022 assessment. So the grand total of assessment, we saw a 10% increase of about, or 240 million in assessment. Broken down, residential also saw a 10% increase. The non-res assessment went up slightly. Dip property went up almost 15% or 114 million. Linear, 7% increase. Farmland regulated assessment, so there's very little change year over year. And then exempt properties saw another pretty big increase of 9%. So good news all around in the assessment, I would say. And I'll break down those numbers a little more based on like new construction and market in the next few slides. Next slide just shows kind of a bar graph showing the same assessment changes. Obviously good to see those bars going up. And then the next slide right here shows it really good. Few years there from 2018 to 2020 saw a decline in the overall assessment, and then last year saw a small increase, and then obviously 2022 we see that large jump of 10%. Next, taxable assessment change compared by percentage. So a majority of your ratepayers this year are going to see a fairly large increase in their assessments. As you can see, up to 10%, 40% of ratepayers see between 1 to 10% increase. 95% total will see either no change or 25% increase. Obviously not 25% total, but a majority are going to see that 1 to 10% increase. Next slide just shows it in compared by dollars. Again, a majority are going to see, about 40% going to see that increase as well. 94% total will see a noticeable increase, I would say. New rules and permits. New rules this year, 18. Those are mostly new subdivisions. Development permits, pretty status quo, 71 this year compared to 70 last year. So nothing too crazy there. And so here shows the change, new res. So of that 9%, 10% increase, almost 8% of it is based on the market. So that's just based on sales data that we've got last year. 9 million or 9.75 million in new construction from new permits. So again, a majority of the change is due to the market. Non-res, again, all pretty much based on market change, which is pretty good to see after the last couple years of negative. Now I'll turn it back over to Troy, and he'll kind of go over these next few slides just to show a little bit more of a breakdown.
Thanks, Chris. So up until now, all of the numbers that Chris spoke about was Woodlands County globally, so it didn't break down by region. So this slide here gives you an idea of the different areas of the municipality and how the market reacted year over year, and what kind of growth we saw in each of those areas. So if you look at this, you know, from the outset, you'd look at it and think, well, the Whitecourt area saw the least amount of increase. Well, it's not necessarily true. It saw the most dollars in increase because it's the highest valued properties in the municipality already are around there. And then if you compare to, say, for example, Fort Assiniboia and Goose Lake area, from a percentage perspective, you look at that and say, oh my goodness, what's going on? Well, there's some sales activity, you all are aware of that. But even though that area of the municipality increased by 16% compared to the Whitecourt area at less than 5%, that 16% didn't even amount to the same amount of dollars as the Whitecourt area. So on paper it looks alarming. I don't think there's cause for concern, but this is all the information that we want you to have when you're going to your tax rates setting. And the point that we want to get across is that overall your residential assessment base increased by 10%, right? So in a perfect world, budget's the same year over year, you have the ability to compress tax rates if that was yours there.
Yeah, the question I have is if, for example, in the Goose Lake area or my area, there's more property sold that has residents put on it, that automatically would increase the assessment of that particular property because it would have been farmland before, and now it has that parcel on it. So that's kind of what we're looking at here when we're looking at that.
So those numbers would fall under the growth category.
Okay.
So the growth is new construction, something that wasn't there last year that is now.
Yeah.
And the inflation is, it was worth X last year and Y this year. The difference is inflation. And so you look at the Goose Lake area, we've got just over 3 million in actual growth, in the Whitecourt area just under 5 million in actual growth. So
is that, if we're seeing more development permits in that area for residential, we're gonna see some more growth.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. You bet. And then the next slide I added this year, I wanted to give you a little bit more comfort, I suppose you could say, regarding the previous slide. So as you may or may not be aware, the Municipal Government Act says the median assessment to sale ratio needs to be between 95 and 105%. So property sells, it's assessed at 100,000, sells for 102,000, divide assessment by sale price, that would be like a 98% ratio, okay? Do that for all of the properties that sell, line them up from highest to lowest, and the middle one, or the median, has to be between 95 and 105%. That's the first test that audit does. What I've done on this slide is broke it out per area, even though the municipal affairs doesn't do that. We do it just so that we know that we're within the proper specs in each area. And if you look to the far right, you can see the median on all improved sales is just below 100%.
So, Troy, what would cause an irregular number? So something that was outside those boundaries.
For a median or just in general?
Both.
There always will be outliers.
Sure.
There never is a case where I look at 85 improved sales and every one of them is within 95 and 105. That's simply impossible.
Yeah.
The market's not that pure.
Okay.
There could be a case of I sell my property to my son, give him a great deal.
Yeah.
Well, if we know that, we're going to code that sale out because it's not indicating a true market transaction. Or somebody just had to leave, really wanted to get out, so they put it up for sale and it sold cheap. Or somebody really wanted to have their property and offered them more money and more money and more money. Finally, okay, fine, I'll sell it. So those are the hard ones to identify because somebody's willing to pay an amount of money and somebody's willing to accept that amount of money. That's the definition of market value.
Right. But you guys would, sorry to interrupt, but you guys would analyze that and maybe kick those ones out?
Yeah, if there's something about it that we can identify that's irregular,
yeah,
then for sure.
Okay.
And the first ones that we look into are the ones that fall out of that 95 to 105% range. Not saying that they should automatically be in there, but if they aren't in that range, that means to us that there's something about it that might not be right. It might be right, and we just need to catch up with the assessment, and that happens from time to time.
Okay, good. So these numbers, you've gone through your analysis, you've kicked out the outliers, and this is...
So these are including all sales that were left in the analysis.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about this part? Nope. Okay. I'm gonna pass it back to Chris for a bit here.
Yeah, so this just shows every year we re-inspect 20% of the municipality. So in the spring, summer, I will do a reinspection of, I guess this year's gonna be White Court West area. So I'll be going to every property in that area and just kind of confirming that what we have on our file is what's there, kind of thing. If I need to talk to the homeowner, I will. If not, I don't necessarily have to talk to everybody. And then I'll come back in the winter time, fall, winter, and re-inspect the whole Woodlands County, checking out on new permits or permits that weren't started or completed from the last couple of years. Or if there are sales that are out of whack that we need to maybe try and talk to somebody, I'll be out there and try and get more information at that time. And then, yeah, so we do that every year. So that's kind of the process.
And it kind of, you know, coming through COVID, it kind of changed our practice a little bit. Not just ours, assessment in general. People aren't as willing to have a stranger knock on their door and start asking a bunch of questions. I mean, it's never really been a normal thing, but you know, identification on the vehicle, on our bodies, and we explain who we are, and normally people are good with it. But with COVID, it's really like, if we don't need to bug somebody, we're not going to go knock on the door and say, hey, I'm here, see ya, right? If everything checks out good on this, on what we have on the assessment, on our records, there's no new buildings, no buildings have been removed, it doesn't look like there's been any major renovations, then we're going to carry on. But we do from time to time we'll roll up on a property and find a shop or a garage or whatever the case that wasn't permitted, and then we'll pass that on to the development team to say, hey, you might want to follow up on this.
All right, and then just moving forward, kind of just discuss what we talked about there. So yeah, I'll do the re-inspections in the White Court West area, and we'll see what the market has going forward. And now I'll pass her on to Sean, and he'll do.
Is there any other questions for Troy and Chris about the residential, the 10% increase? Obviously a substantial increase this year, but lots of that is due to inflation, some growth from new construction, but I think the majority is inflationary due to the market.
Yeah,
correct?
like it was really weird coming through COVID. Sorry, when COVID first happened, you know, everybody's like, what's happening with my property's not going to be worth anything, and then quickly people realized that's not the case. And then shortly after that, which we saw last year, people were okay spending money, and so last year we saw a bit of an increase, and now that's just rolling forward, and just seeing a typical Alberta 10% increase, which, you know, historically isn't terribly uncommon. Sorry.
Yeah, just a question. Provincially, my understanding is that there has been a big movement to rural from urban, and is that what you're seeing as well?
As far
it's
as
not just here, it's happening in all
we're
of
seeing our rural municipalities have very similar increases. Yeah.
and do you get a sense whether that may be continuing or?
I don't see any signs of it not.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's something that we need to be aware of, that's happening, and it may
Yeah.
affect some of our planning.
I mean, it'll affect some of your planning.
It may affect some of our planning.
I mean, it'll affect some of your planning as assessment goes. It just, we kind of have to follow and understand what happened rather than try to predict, right?
Okay.
So, not to get super granular on this, but when you guys do an assessment on a structure, is it similar to how an insurance company would do it, where it's based on replacement cost? Is that, or do you is it market? Is it combination?
At the end of the day, the assessment is a reflection of market value.
Okay.
Step one is, what's the market value of the land? So now we have to look at all the land sales. So the one of those charts had improved sales and vacant sales. That's the first step. So once we have that figured out, then when we look at the improved sales, if we remove the land part of it that we've already now analyzed, the rest has to fall within the buildings. So the starting point is how an insurance company would do it. We take the size and age and type and all that kind of stuff, and we do apply a cost number to that, and then the difference has to be made up. Whether it's a positive or negative difference has to be made up. We call that a market adjustment factor. And so the whole approach is called a market modified cost approach. So we start with the cost, but at the end of the day, you should look at the number and say, yeah, that's ballpark what the property is worth.
So if the cost, say the cost was $100,000, market was 150, then you guys would adjust towards market,
Yep,
and vice versa.
yep, that's it.
Okay.
What about, you said the regulated farmland, like we're seeing an incredible inflation in the market value, if you wanna put it that way, to farmland, and yet we're not seeing that reflected in.
Yes, that's a very interesting / hot topic in rural Alberta. We are entering into a time where regulated assessments in Alberta are under review, of which farmland is a regulated assessment. To my knowledge, it's not on the docket to be reviewed, but to give you a quick and dirty on how farmland assessment is calculated, it's a manual, it's regulated, and it says if it's dark black soil, level, low stone coverage, blah, 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 it's this much per acre. All the way down to it's hilly, poor soil quality, lots of stone cover, it'll be, you follow the formula across it, it'll be a much lower number. And year over year, that number doesn't change unless you physically change that property. You bulldoze the trees down and cultivate the land. And to put it into perspective, think about a quarter section of farmland in Woodlands County, say 150 to 225,000 ballpark. Same quarter of farmland in Nehill County, which is one of our clients, $1 million. And the assessment in Woodlands would be maybe 15 to 20,000, and in Nehill might be 30,000 because of better soil quality, but it's not capturing the market value at all. Yeah.
Then the second question would be, how much lead time do we get as a municipality to, before they start a review on that regulated rate?
Very good question.
I will speak about that at the end, in the most recent update that I've seen in public from the province. And so again, I'll touch it at the end, but I'll address it now. When that will occur, as far as I know, right now, I believe they've been reaching out to stakeholders about that this consultation will be happening. But the actual consultation and which regulated property types and when will that occur, that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
And of course, we're coming into provincial election time, the writ period coming up here, so I anticipate that we probably won't hear anything until later in the year.
Even on which
Yeah.
which regulated property types they are planning on reviewing. Nobody has said to me that farmland is being considered.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's interesting. Farmland, the manual that we use today for farmland assessment was originally written in like the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, because it's a regulated assessment. Back then, there was tax policy built into the assessment. That's why it's such a low number, and that's just kind of carried forward. And now, you know, we hear all these things about taxes and assessment and how they should be separate, which they should. The municipality should have the ability to tax farmland however they, you know, accordingly. And it just, because the assessment is such a fraction of the total true market value of it, your hands are tied. On the other hand, if the province said, okay, now we're gonna assess farmland at market value, this chart that shows the percentages, your farmland would be like in the hundreds of percent increase. So then you would have to do something, because obviously the tax impact in 1 year would be massive for farm landowners.
Yeah, and if memory serves, I think all of our agricultural land is less than 100,000 in taxes for revenue generation.
Well, and I guess that's why I asked the question, is because you know that agriculture uses a big chunk of the infrastructure, which is linked. And so, you know, when that happens, there has to be an awareness of how that's gonna happen, and that's gonna be kind of a difficult explanation right now.
Yeah.
Given that the productive value is nowhere near where the market value is.
I suspect that's probably why it's always been on the back burner with regards to a review, because if the truth be told, if they really dug in and did a full review, if they come up with the final analysis that said, yeah, it's okay the way it is, I'd be shocked. Okay, we'll pass it on to Sean.
Sure. Yeah, so I will just briefly talk about this slide. Gone through this before. This is the industrial team. Our industrial team at Accurate hasn't changed in the past 8 years because the last employee that we hired was Allie Dietrich. So she is our most junior employee, but even she has 8 years of experience. But this is the industrial team at Accurate. Although we do not perform the assessment for the designated industrial property, so think oil and gas, there are still other types of industrial property that if Troy and Chris or the municipality needs assistance with, people from this team will take care of those assessments. So I'm still in Woodlands County from time to time. And the properties that I would look at in Woodlands County would be non-designated industrial properties. So these would be properties that are not regulated by the Alberta Energy Regulator or the Alberta Utilities Commission or the Canadian Energy Regulator. So these types of properties would be sawmills, there's gravel pits, there's transload facilities, there's the large standard general property that's west of Whitecourt. Those would be types of facilities that are industrial in nature. They may have a component of machinery and equipment, but they're not taken care of by the province because they just do, in layman's terms, the oil and gas type properties. Next slide, please. And those oil and gas properties are called designated industrial properties. So on this original slide here, with all of the assessment classes and the numbers, the designated industrial property is assessed by the province. The other industrial properties that are not designated fall into the non-residential category. So that's where those properties fall. So I'll just flip the next slide. However, I can speak to your designated industrial property. Accurate used to perform that assessment function for Woodlands County for many years, so I'm fairly familiar with lots of the oil and gas type properties in the municipality. And I'm showing this chart this year because just like with residential and some of the other assessment classes, there was a major increase to your designated industrial property assessment. And that was because of two things. So the first is, since it is a regulated type of assessment, there's different modifiers each year that are set by the province. There was large increases to the modifiers this year because of what we've seen in the market. And the second is there was one property, which was ANC, which is assessed by the province, and it had an allowance on the property, so a form of depreciation. However, the province did a review of different types of facilities that had this type of specific depreciation on it, and they determined that they were going to remove this from a whole bunch of properties across the province for equity reasons. So that property alone, their assessment went up approximately $80 million. So that one ratepayer's assessment has an extreme increase to it. So I just want council and administration to be aware that there is one property that, from a designated industrial property standpoint, from my viewpoint, it's a definite, it's an outlier. It had an extreme increase to it. When the provincial assessor's office speaks to this increase, they're confident that it's defendable. I believe they have reached out to those companies directly. So I think ANC would know about this increase, that it's coming. The designated industrial property assessments have been mailed, so those assessment notices get mailed from the province. They have been mailed to industry, so those are gone out. But that's why there was a major jump in your designated industrial property assessment.
Just one question over here.
So you say that the province had some modifiers on the DIP and they took them off. Does the municipality have the ability to put their own modifiers on?
No, so there was two parts. So one part is assessment year modifiers. That affects all of the designated industrial properties. So every designated industrial property is affected by these modifiers. So the modifiers increased this year. That happens province-wide. It affects all properties regardless of municipality. Now with ANC on that specific property, it had a different type of what's called additional depreciation. And historically, there have been properties around the province that had additional depreciation for all sorts of different types of reasons. It could be a market obsolescence, a functional obsolescence, locational obsolescence. It gets quite complex and granular. However, the province grouped an entire segment of industry that had this depreciation applied to it, and they've decided to remove that depreciation. So can the municipality say we want that depreciation for ANC left on? No, you can't. The assessment's, I guess, dictated by the province, so it is what it is, and they supply that assessment. So.
And to be clear too, the assessment year modifier has remained pretty flat the last 3-4 years.
The modifiers, I'm just gonna look at, I actually brought a chart. The modifiers haven't seen great fluctuations in the past couple of years, but this year, the modifiers went up quite substantially for different property types. So for designated industrial property, lots of that is considered machinery and equipment. The modifier for machinery and equipment went up about 6.5%. So if you had an assessment of $100,000 last year, that assessment now goes up by 6.5% because of the modifier. With your linear assessment, that's also a regulated form of assessment. Those modifiers, depending on which type of linear property, went up as well. So for example, for wells, so the actual well, the modifier for well went up by 14%, which is quite substantial because in past years we haven't seen those spikes. So that's what happened with in regards to those modifiers. So your linear assessment went up by 7%. But of that 7%, almost all of it is due to the changes in the modifiers. So the changes in the assessment year modifiers is pretty much why your linear assessment increased by 7%.
But just to clarify,
Yeah.
with the one company with ANC that you talk about, that's not a modifier. That's the depreciation is no longer being applied.
Correct. So on that property assessment, there was a form of depreciation that is now removed. So that assessment increases.
Think of it like an economic depreciation that they had applied in the past that they said is no longer required.
I just think from, the balance sheet, the expenses are gonna increase in a competitive market. That's gonna affect their operation.
Yeah. I'm gonna ask Sean a question if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sean, do you know, so the notices have been mailed, they've been out for a month and a half.
Yeah.
Do you know, are there any
Complaints
filed on these changes?
If there's complaints filed on DIP property, it goes to the Land and Property Rights Tribunal, and then I believe they have to notify the municipality. I have not heard in Woodlands County of any complaints filed as of yet. However, the complaint deadline is not yet over. I believe the complaint deadline for DIP property is sometime, it's end of the month, early May.
Yeah.
So the complaint period is still open. Yeah.
And with respect to how a complaint would be constructed, would that be purely based on a difference of opinion on depreciation, or what would the argument be?
The arguments would be interpretation of the current legislation, and then interpretation of board decisions on previous complaints. I have heard other municipalities that have had an outlier in an assessment like this, and that's their question. Well, could there be an assessment complaint? Well, the answer is yes, there could be. Any ratepayer can file a complaint on an assessment, definitely.
So that's another good piece of information to have while you're thinking about setting your tax rates. Although you see an overall 10% increase, potentially there's 80 million of assessment at risk on one property. That's your job.
Well, and that's the problem when you get these outliers, because we have, you know, the one mill rate to apply to that.
That's right.
And if you've got that one property that's affected, they're gonna get hit. But I also would expect if it's something that they knew that they were able to write off and that program kind of came to a close, they're probably aware of it, but
Well, I'm sure they're aware of it.
yeah.
Yes, the companies, I believe that all companies who had a property with a form of this type of depreciation was notified that the province was doing a review. And the province was doing a review based on previous board decisions and complaints, because as there are different complaints in different assessment years, the interpretation of legislation can change as time goes on. And what the process was 2 years ago might not be the process now, because the interpretation of the assessment legislation could change based on a board decision. So with changes in previous board decisions, the provincial assessor's office determined we're going to review these properties and see if this type of depreciation, it may have been justified 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, but it may not be justified now with the current climate of how these board decisions have been. So that's why they removed it, but they did it on this whole sector of the industry.
This is the second year of the lumber industry, correct?
Yes, yeah.
The first year, last year, I think they removed the Schedule D depreciation on sawmills.
I believe they did sawmills and then they did pulp
This
and
year's
paper.
pulp.
Yeah, so they've been reviewing all of them, which leads to that outlier. So that 15% growth in dip isn't because somebody decided to have a major drilling program and a whole bunch of capital projects and new infrastructure in the municipality. It's not reflective of growth in your oil and gas industry. It's reflective of a modifier and a removal of depreciation.
And again, just to be clear, the assessment year modifier, because I know there's kind of a few pieces to this formula, so I want to break out that modifier really carefully. That assessment year modifier remained pretty flat through 17, 18, 19, 20. Look, we're finally, and that was kind of something that municipalities really got used to seeing increase annually at the provincial assessors level, so they could kind of lean on that for more revenue. And we stopped seeing that for about a 4 or 5 year period, correct?
Yep.
Or am I putting words in your mouth?
No, I don't have the chart of the modifiers like the last, 4 or 5 years. Like I don't have what machinery and equipment kind of has done, but I know that like during those COVID years and even a little bit before, it was quite flat. Like we did not see 6.5% per year, but I do remember times prior to those 5 years where we'd see 3% a year, 2% a year. And what happens when you calculate an industrial assessment, it's a regulated form of assessment, so there's a value, and it gets times by these modifiers, but there's also depreciation. So each year, it might depreciate by 2 to 3%. But then if you have a modifier of 2 to 3%, your industrial base stays predictable and the same, which is great for municipalities. However, if the modifier is nothing, then you're subject to that depreciation and your assessments are going to slowly creep down. This year, there was growth, but of course it wasn't true growth. It was because of the increase in the modifier.
Okay.
So which slide am I on now? That one? Okay, so moving forward, this slide has been in our presentations for a couple years now. And the reason it's been here for a couple years is because it hasn't changed. So as Troy mentioned, there is going to be a re-engagement of stakeholders for another attempt at a review of regulated property. The last I heard of this was I was at a property tax convention down in Calgary at the end of March, and there's representatives from the provincial assessor's office there, and they mentioned that there will be a review of regulated property. Which property types and when is still yet to be seen. Farmland is a form of regulated property. We haven't heard that that will be reviewed, but all regulated property in essence is on the table. As a municipality, the RMA would be the stakeholder group representing rural municipalities, very much so. So I would expect that when stakeholders are engaged, I think they have some lessons learned from the last time there was an assessment model review. It did not get implemented, so it did not go according to plan. So I think that there is an appetite now for more stakeholder engagement and hopefully transparency through these, because any review of regulated property affects the assessment base of rural municipalities. So simply put. The next slide, I believe you're all familiar with these three initiatives. So the last time they tried to do an assessment model review, it did not get implemented, but they did implement different initiatives, and these initiatives are still going on right now. So rural municipalities used to collect well drilling equipment tax. That was permanently eliminated in 2021. So any wells drilled in the municipality since 2021, you can no longer collect the well drilling equipment tax. Low producing wells, that is something that is built into the rates for linear property. So if you have a low producing well, they had a lower rate for those wells, just to give some reflection that these wells are low producing, because there are some of those in Alberta. But the biggest one is new wells and pipelines. So if you had a new well drilled, you would get linear assessment for that well. For the assessment years of 2021, 22, and 23, any new wells drilled, you cannot collect linear assessment and taxation on. Similarly with a new pipeline. If there's a new pipeline in the municipality and it gets built in 2022, it does not appear on your linear assessment. So the province, within the linear assessment, they actually give each municipality a report that talks about how much assessment due to this policy change. So how much assessment you cannot collect taxation on. So that report goes to the municipality every year during this initiative. So look to that report if you're curious about what that amount is.
Just, I'm gonna interject quickly. This slide, the 7% increase on linear is not counting, like this is all the taxable part. So that's the number for you to concentrate on.
So the expectation would be in 25 there'd be another bump.
Yeah.
However, if there's a review of regulated property, yes, those properties now become assessable and taxable, but what are the rates and what are the rules then? That's crystal ball.
It's not money in the bank is what it is.
Yeah, that's still yet to be determined. So lots of information, and I know council and administration in Woodlands is very knowledgeable, as you do have a large industrial base in the municipality. So I know you're very knowledgeable about lots of the information I presented. It might be just reiterating something that you already know, but for those of us that don't, it's just good to be cognizant and aware of.
So I might direct this question to you, John. I know in for those folks that are listening, the well drilling that eliminated province. As you'd mentioned in that YouTube interview that you'd given, the province eliminated the tax, but the taxable income actually came to the municipality. So the province, if I have this right, the province didn't really have a net decrease. It was just municipalities.
Yeah, they're very generous with municipalities' tax revenue.
So
That's the problem. And all three of these are are affecting municipal revenues. So if those wells are producing, they're still getting the royalties. So they're generating the royalties off of it, and the equipment and well drilling tax doesn't affect Woodlands too much. We don't really see a lot of that happening here. But for an area that is seeing a lot of new wells and activity hammered in, that's usually when the intensive activity is beating up on their infrastructure and they're seeing a lot of expense on roads. That's why that was put in there in the first place, was to make up for some of the roads and things like that and the effects it was going to have on the local infrastructure, so they would have a method to recover some of that money. That's gone now. So how do you end up with how do you afford to replace the infrastructure as it gets damaged or wears out? And then the new wells and pipelines, the property tax holiday, we had conversations about that a lot because it seemed weird that you would qualify for a tax holiday if you were making a new development but you hadn't paid your taxes for previous developments. That's not a requirement under the legislation. Never was. It's insane that you can, because you're effectively using the people of Alberta as a bank, as an investment bank. That's what you're doing as a company. You're not paying the taxes. You're developing a new piece of property, and then you're generating revenue off of that and not paying taxes to the municipality for 3 years, and that's all sanctioned by the province. So hopefully under the new guideline, like I was just looking at this, and if they say they're not going to issue a new license unless the taxes are paid, then I think we'd catch them on this one here. So.
Right. From a tax, from the outstanding tax.
Well, they wouldn't be able to plug a new well.
Right.
They wouldn't be able to build a new well.
Right.
And take advantage of this tax holiday. If they haven't paid their old taxes, they won't get a license to develop the new one.
Yep.
So, but we still don't know the numbers around that yet. But yeah, it's not. But this really affected the municipality's ability to generate revenue. Did I get that about right, or?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't read it, but I heard of an article that Danielle Smith put out about not allowing new activity on companies that have outstanding tax bills. So that's
Yeah, that's a ministerial order coming from the Minister of Municipal Affairs to the AER. So they're not going to allow license transfers, and they're not going to allow new licenses for companies that haven't paid their taxes.
I think that's a step in the right direction.
It is. It's totally a step in the right direction. We don't know what the threshold for that is yet. And that was the big issue. Like in Trident's case, we had companies that were buying up some of Trident's assets that hadn't paid their taxes either for years. So that was a bit of an issue. One thing I was going to ask was have you heard any rumblings on this idea of a fixed mill rate on linear pipelines?
I have not.
Very little. I don't know enough to speak to it.
Okay. Any other questions? No? All right. I think we got everything we needed here. So, Councillor Dean?
I was just prepared to make a motion that council accept the accurate assessment group presentation as information.
Okay, very good. Any discussion on that motion? All in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. And, sorry, Councillor,
I'll make a
Colgan.
motion to adjourn.
Okay. Motion to adjourn. All in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. We stand adjourned.